Guilt and shame come from other external forces telling you you're not enough, telling you you're not good enough, doing enough, feeling enough, thinking enough. Figure out what comes from inside of you and also identify how you can use that to drive and motivate you rather than sinking into that place of guilt and shame that leads to mistakes and pain and hurt and all this bad stuff.
Hey friends, welcome to the Changing Work podcast. We are so glad you're here.
My name is Nick.
And I'm Scott.
And this is the podcast where we talk about changing work from the inside out.
So if you're into making the workplace and the world a better experience via conscious business practices, stick around. This is for you.
Arielle, it's really good to connect with you. I'm going to do exactly what I've been doing for everybody else. I'm going to read your bio. And what I would encourage you to do is if there's anything that's missing in your bio, something that you'd like to share with the world about you that doesn't really get encapsulated in one of those little bullets, just give a little thought to that while you awkwardly listen to me read your bio to you. And then we'll go from there. How's that sound?
Let's embrace the awkwardness. I'm here for it.
Perfect. So Arielle is the founder of Trans and Caffeinated Consulting, which I just, first of all, love that name, is a transgender workplace trainer, public speaker, and mother to the 3 most different cats in the world. Their work centers on increasing access, resources, and opportunities for people of marginalized identities with the emphasis on transgender communities. An admirer of media's ability to shape culture, Arielle's all-time favorite show is The Good Place. I also really like the show. The understatedly profound and thoughtful comedy dares to dream of a world in which rather than being punished for their mistakes, people are given the love and support that they need to do good. Similarly, Arielle's approach to their work is grounded in the need to relinquish guilt and shame in order to be effective accomplices in the liberation of marginalized people. Wow. I love your bio. What did I miss there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the reason I use the phrasing of all transgender people is because we know that all struggles for liberation are connected to each other, right? Like transgender people are not free until Black transgender people are free, until disabled transgender people are free. And so that phrasing is not insignificant. The reason I frame it always as the liberation of all transgender people is because if I am doing my work correctly, and we as, advocates more broadly are doing our work correctly, it means that we are lifting up all stories across all fights for liberation because we cannot be free until the most marginalized among us are free.
I love that mission. So tell me a little bit, how did you get to this place? Like, where's your origin story? How did you found Trans and Caffeinated Consulting? And I'm particularly interested in the caffeinated part there. Like, why is that so important?
I mean, it's going to sound real silly. The name of the blog comes because I had left a role working in LGBTQ advocacy to open that big fancy Starbucks in Manhattan because the nonprofit job that I was at did not offer me health insurance and Starbucks did. And so a couple years into working at this Starbucks, I was really feeling a hunger to engage more in liberation work and in advocacy work again. And I wasn't able to leave that role because, again, I still needed health insurance. And so I thought to myself, how do I want to engage in this work without threatening my ability to survive? And so I sat down on my computer. It's like, okay, I want to use my life and my experiences to make the world a better place. And the ways that I have I know how to do that is by sharing my story. And so Trans and Caffeinated was literally just, I sat down on a computer and I was like, I need a website name. I need a name for the place that I'm going to house my storytelling. And WordPress asked me for a website name. And I said Trans and Caffeinated because I was a working barista and wanted to engage more in trans advocacy. But as I continued writing under the name of Trans and Caffeinated, it sort of became this known entity within the spaces I operated in. And so when it came time to pivot away from working in coffee, I kept the name. It was, no reason to establish a new brand when it was already known. But to sort of back up a little, because I know you also asked sort of how I came into doing this work, was I was sent to a therapeutic boarding school in 2013 that was like vaguely operating under the same structures as conversion therapy programs. And so this was actually where I first came out as transgender. This was in October 2013, almost 11 years ago. And they essentially spent the next 2 years trying to convince me that I was not trans, and using some pretty horrendous tactics to like bully me into accepting the identity that they wanted me to accept. And so after graduating from this program, after a while of like working through the rage and hurt of that, I reached a point of acceptance where instead of feeling angry, I wanted to center my life, build my life around making sure that future generations of trans young people do not have to endure the same kind of treatment that I did and that so many other trans young people did. And so that is what led me to do advocacy work in the first place.
Well, first of all, I'm so sorry that you had that experience, but it sounds like it really kind of catalyzed this new trajectory for you, and the amount of work and the amount of help you're putting out there in the world is tremendous. So it's maybe a little bit bittersweet there. I'm curious, in terms of your, work specifically as a transgender workplace trainer, what are some of the common misconceptions that people come up with, or some of the things that you encounter, and how do you go about addressing those misconceptions?
Yeah, it's a good question. The reason I center guilt and shame in my work is because there is often this understanding that the best ally is the person that knows the most. And I contest that. I feel that the best allies or accomplices in the goals of any liberation struggle are the ones not that know the most, but that are willing to do the most, are willing to learn the most, are willing to change the most. And so when I enter these spaces, the folks that I find are really engaged in this struggle for the long haul are not the people that necessarily even come from the most knowledgeable backgrounds or like have met the most trans people. They're the ones that come into it with I just really want to learn. I'm so eager to learn. I'm so eager to do better, learn how I can do better. Like those are the people that, as a trainer, as a trans person, are the biggest green flags to me, because those are the people that actually are excited to learn how to do better. And I think that segues also very neatly with a misunderstanding about trans people, which is that we expect people to be perfect. I and most other trans people I know of, obviously we're not a monolith. I don't expect people to be perfect. I do expect them to want to learn. I do expect people to understand that we come from a society, that we've been enmeshed with a society that is centered around cisgender, white, heterosexual, non-disabled people's comfort and normalizes those identities as, or centers those identities as the norm. I do expect people to reckon with that and to understand how that comfort needs to be a little bit threatened in order to get to the place where we can actually include people who are not that, trans people of every identity.
So what comes up for me, is this idea of allyship, and so much of what you were speaking about earlier in terms of like people not needing to be perfect, but wanting to learn, having the desire to learn. When we think about allyship in particular, like what are some of the roles that allies can really play in supporting transgender individuals, both in the workplace and just more broadly in society?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very tailored to the individual. And I do actually, one of the trainings that I offer is specifically about this, about finding each person finding their unique role in the movement. There is a lot of pressure just in every space to be like one certain type of ally, right? Like we expect people to always be posting on social media. We expect people to always, correct people when they're doing something that's messed up. We expect people to always show up to protests. We expect people to do like A, B, and C list of things that we say makes them a good ally. When the reality is building sustainable allyship is most about engaging with the movement in ways that feel A, like sustainable for each individual, but B, most aligned with their skill set. And so, for example, not everyone's great at doing research, but in order to advance our liberation work, we need to do a lot of research to sort of like understand what has already been written about, understand how, certain people in various areas of the country like feel about trans people. Like in order to advance our goals, we need a ton of research. And there actually aren't that many skilled researchers within liberation spaces. And so if someone is an excellent skilled researcher, being able to pull together those resources is something that's needed. That person might not necessarily feel comfortable and confident at protests. And in fact, attending a protest because they feel pressured to could take away the energy that they could best spend engaging in a way that plays directly to their skill set. And so rather than offer specific guidance of, oh, hey, here's how someone can be an effective ally, I would encourage everyone to think about the skills that you have, the things that you are best at, and start to understand and start to explore how you can use those to advance the goals of liberation work, because everybody has skills. And everybody's skills can in some way be used to advance this work. I mean, even event planning, right? Like event planning, sure, you're putting on an event, right? But any event can raise money for an organization. Any skills that anyone has can be used to get us where we need to go as a community.
Mm-hmm. So maybe up-leveling this a little bit, when we talk more about companies and organizations, imagine this is a lot of the spaces that you're moving through and doing these trainings in. How do companies foster a more inclusive environment for transgender employees and honestly really ensure that they feel supported and safe in the workplace?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of that is letting trans employees do the speak for ourselves. There is often what I see in workplaces is, somebody gets brought in to do an overhaul of the manual, and maybe that person's trans, maybe that person's not. Often they're not. Often the folks that are leading this work are not transgender themselves. And so the first thing that I would encourage anyone to do is to give trans folks a platform, generally an anonymous platform where they can voice their concerns comfortably with the existing company culture and be a part of improving that. And of course, that means that trans people are already in that workplace, which isn't the case for every place. And so in situations where that's not true, what I often encourage folks to do is to pull together a cohort of consultants, pull together a cohort of trans consultants who come from various backgrounds, trans disabled people, Black trans people, trans people that come from lower class backgrounds, and engage them in focus groups about, okay, here are some of the problems that we've been having. Here here is how our company culture usually looks. Here is how meetings are structured. Here is what a typical day looks like for an employee in this workplace. Here is our manual, and giving them money to do this work, but also the time and resources and energy to understand the current company culture. And then give your company candid feedback about what they need to do better. Because the reality is, whether your company has trans people in it already, whether your company doesn't, if we don't give trans people a space to give candid feedback about what needs to be better and improve the workspace, then we may still be inviting trans folks into an environment that is hostile towards their existence. And that is not what we want to do, right? The focus cannot just be on diversity without also focusing on how to make folks feel included and supported once they're there.
Mhm. Yeah, and maybe this is like a little riff on the same question, in terms of like actionable steps organizations can take to increase things like access to resources or opportunities for people from marginalized identities. Like, are there some thoughts around that you could share?
Yeah. So one is we know that trans folks tend to spend more in healthcare than other folks because a lot of, hormones aren't always covered, surgeries aren't covered. There's this sort of framing that I use called the trans tax, which are these additional costs that trans people need to pay that their cisgender counterparts don't, for things like name changes in healthcare. And so one thing that I've seen past workplaces do is bring in healthcare consultants who can help trans employees specifically, as well as disabled employees, access the healthcare that they need within existing healthcare structures that are not built with us in mind. And then also enable things like HRAs and FSAs that free up literally money for trans people to access this healthcare. Because the reality is that most trans people are in jobs that don't pay enough to afford the healthcare that we need to survive.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so that's one action step. The other is setting up ERGs or whatever your organization calls it, resource group specifically for trans people, not LGBTQ people more broadly, but trans people specifically, to have a container to discuss their needs and discuss what needs to change within the workplace. And rather than necessarily have the framing of the ERGs be social activities, which I see is what a lot of organizations set up, having that container be specifically for discussing the organizational environment and what needs to change. I've seen organizations call these caucus groups, like identity-based caucus groups, but really having the emphasis be feedback generation and discussion of what needs to improve.
Mm.
Those are two examples.
Those are great. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so maybe completely another direction here. You mentioned earlier this idea of guilt and shame.
Yeah.
I'm kind of curious a little bit, in your approach to effective advocacy, can you maybe elaborate a little bit on how this has shaped your own personal journey and the work that you're doing now, like this understanding of relinquishing guilt and shame?
Yeah. I think guilt and shame are, especially in the age of social media, often used to spur people into action, right? So is you're not doing enough or you're a bad ally when what we see is that kind of sucks the wind out of people's sails, right? It's not that those people aren't necessarily doing enough. It's not a question of, none of us can be doing enough. There's so much work that needs to be done. However, each of us only has finite energy in our days. Each of us only has a certain amount of time and energy to contribute to this work. And so I find that part of the work of being an effective long-term ally is working to understand what motivates you intrinsically, right? Like guilt and shame will always drain us. Guilt and shame will always burn us out. If we are operating from a place of guilt and shame about not doing enough, about the times in which we've messed up or done something wrong in trying to support a marginalized community, that will just make us freeze. That will just shoot us into this response of well, I can't do it right, so I'm going to back away and I'm just going to disengage from this work. That will lead us to causing more harm, as many of us do when we're operating from a sense of shame. Often our instinct is to put a quick Band-Aid on the situation, right? Because shame has this urgency associated with it. Shame has this, oh my God, I need to fix this associated with it, which is counterproductive when the goal of this work is not figuring out how to do it fast, is figuring out how to do it correctly. It's figuring out how to be the best support, the most thoughtful support to marginalized communities. That is incompatible with guilt and shame. And so what I always encourage people to do is really take some time to sit with yourself and think about what drives you intrinsically, right? Is it because you just really want to do better? Is it because you have a trans loved one and you want the world to be a better place for them? Is it because you personally know what it's like to be discriminated against on the basis of another identity? And so it matters a lot to you that other people aren't discriminated against on the basis of theirs. Identify what it is inside of you, not outside of you, because that's where guilt and shame come from, right? Guilt and shame come from other external forces telling you you're not enough, telling you you're not good enough, doing enough, feeling enough, thinking enough. Figure out what comes from inside of you and also identify how you can use that to drive and motivate you rather than sinking into that place of guilt and shame that leads to mistakes and pain and hurt and all this bad stuff.
Yeah, and something that you just mentioned there, this idea of kind of looking within and maybe even noticing like where in some instances maybe you were marginalized or otherwise discriminated against because of specific aspects of yourself. There's a self-awareness there that I think is really interesting that you're kind of touching on. That, at least in my experience, what I found is the more self-aware I've been, the more introspection I've been able to do, the better I've been able to connect with others and be able to empathize with the experience that others might be going through. Is that kind of what you're touching on there?
Very much so. Yeah. I mean, I think that pulling it back, I know that the biggest predictor of showing up holistically for any marginalized community is having empathy with that community, is especially having a personal connection with someone in that community, but really just feeling empathy towards the plight of whatever community it is that you are wanting to show up for. And so to whatever degree any of us can find a way to personally relate the experiences of a group of people that we're not a part of to our own experiences, we should do it, because not from a comparison standpoint, but from the standpoint of like, oh, I can understand how that might feel. And because of that, I feel a personal commitment to doing better, right? Like the quickest way to make a group of people not care about someone other than them is this thing that often like our governments do, which is dehumanize groups of people. We've seen it throughout history. We've seen this time and time again, how world governments, world leaders will dehumanize a group of people in order to justify horrors and atrocities committed against them, because they know that the second the general population feels a degree of empathy towards that population, they will step in and say, oh, actually, this is super messed up and we can't do this. And so we need to do the inverse. We need to make sure that we are all figuring out ways to feel empathy for people who are not us and act on that. Is that is the antidote to what the powers that be, what the cis heteronormative ableist structures that be want us to do to maintain the status quo.
It's a beautiful call to action. So I'm curious also, like you've been doing, it sounds like you've been doing this work for a while now. Have there been any big pivots or moments throughout your career that maybe kind of like changed the direction of your advocacy or the approach that you're taking with all of this, or maybe changed your worldview around this?
Yeah, I mean, my pivot from working with more mainstream LGBTQ organizations to working with more progressive trans organizations was a big one. And I will say that is very much connected to the all transgender people sort of framing that I've presented. More mainstream LGBTQ organizations are beholden often to their white, gay, heterosexual, white, gay, non-disabled, upper middle class to upper class donor base. Whereas trans-led organizations are often more in line with community leaders, and often specifically like community leaders of color. And the result is that work is much more intersectional. It takes into account all transgender people and not just one type of transgender person. And that has fundamentally shifted the approach that I take to my work. Rather than speaking just to my experience, something that I always strive to do is to bring in other voices, to bring in disabled trans voices, to bring in Black trans voices, to run panel events where we get to hear from a variety of perspectives, not just my own, because the reality is I am a white trans woman who is often perceived as a cis woman when I move through public and was raised in an upper class background have had a lot of resources throughout my life, had a like full scholarship to college, like not in debt, et cetera, et cetera. Like my experience is not representative of all trans people. And so making that pivot professionally with the types of organizations I was engaged with has led me to do work that is more inclusive of all transgender people and not just my own experience.
Mm-hmm. Maybe like a dovetail off of that one, on your journey, as you've been going through this, what have you found to be some of the most rewarding aspects of the work that you're doing? And then maybe conversely on that, what were some of the most challenging things that you're noticing that continue to persist?
Yeah. Rewarding is always people, getting to hear a particular thing that I've said that has resonated with someone, a particular takeaway that has led a person or a group of people to have one of those aha moments in their allyship work. That is always so rewarding, especially because I don't often get to hear that, right? Like I mean, the wonderful audience here, like I can't see any of y'all. Like it's not necessary. Like if any of you has something I've said that really resonates with you, find me on LinkedIn, find me on Instagram. Like I would love to hear, because that is the work that drives me and like keeps my fire as an advocate lit. The most challenging part is just people love to be mean to trans people online. People love, I've been doxxed several times. People have found where I live. People have bullied me online. People have, tried to steal my information. Like this is unfortunately, especially within this awful culture war moment we're having with the rise in anti-trans legislation, the point that we're at. And so the hardest part is always just like how cruel people can be, the threats of violence, the threats of bodily harm. Like, I don't think I will ever not be upset when those things happen. And that's unfortunately a reality for every single trans person that does this work publicly, is like, many people are not kind to us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I guess 2 last questions for you. Like what gives you hope looking forward?
I heard the last person say that Gen Z and Gen Alpha are coming for the status quo and they are not taking any prisoners, right? Like I see their drive for change and I have so much respect and hope knowing that they are coming up through leadership.
I love that. If people want to find you online, if they want to learn more about the work that you're doing, or maybe want to consult with you to help them along their own advocacy for transgender rights within their organizations, like what's a good place for people to point you to?
Yeah. All my contact info is on transandcaffeinated.com, spelled just like it sounds. You can also find me on LinkedIn at Arielle Rebecca. You can find me on, Instagram is less professional, but I do a lot of sharing and producing content on Instagram, Arielle R. Gordon. But really, like for professional consultation, I do prefer that folks either reach out to me at Arielle at transandcaffeinated.com or submit an inquiry form through my website. LinkedIn, of course, but preference website.
Beautiful. Well, Arielle, thank you so much for the work that you're doing in the world. Thanks for being here and thanks for engaging in this conversation with us. I will be hopefully able to connect with you online soon, and hopefully we get you back in another one of these People Summits at some point.
Amazing. That would be great. Thank you so much for your time, and thanks everyone for listening.